Christ the Redeemer Catholic Church in Thibodaux, Louisiana welcomes you to Sunday, June 21st, 2015. This is Father Mark here on the campus of Creighton University at the Institute for Priestly Formation, and today we're going to introduce a new series on trust. Over the next few weeks, we're going to tackle head-on some real answers to tough questions that all influence our experience of God and our experience of trusting Him. Today, we're going to start by asking the biggest and toughest question. Can we trust God when there's so much evil in the world? As always, we welcome you to join us at Christ the Redeemer and experience our family. Until we see you, remember that God is real and He really wants a relationship with you. Now, let's jump into today's message. Peace be with you, my brothers and sisters. Greetings from the Institute for Priestly Formation at Creighton University. This is Father Mark on Father's Day, June the 21st, 2015. I want to say happy Father's Day to all of the dads out there that might be listening today. If you have our biological father or perhaps a spiritual father, I want to wish you a happy Father's Day. Certainly in light of where I am right now, I want to reach out to all my brother priests and offer them a happy Father's Day also for the spiritual fatherhood that they kind of beget in the world. And to my own dad, Mr. Cool, I want to say happy Father's Day to you. I had the privilege of being with my dad all week this week for the College Baseball World Series up here in Omaha, which is just a few blocks actually away from Creighton's campus, and we had a great time together. Of course, he returned home disappointingly on Friday after LSU lost on Thursday night, but we had a great time together. I cherish those memories that we still share together, and want to wish my dad a happy Father's Day. Certainly in the stadium, remembering lots of things from my childhood with my pop. Certainly as we were watching the College Baseball World Series, I have cherished memories of doing the very same thing in the den at our house, sitting in the lazy boy with my dad watching the College Baseball World Series when it was out there at the old stadium in Rosenblatt Stadium, and certainly LSU and the dynasty that they had in the 90s, and just lots of childhood memories of with my dad and cherish those. I remember as a kid listening to him talk about his own childhood. I remember him bringing me to my grandfather's house lots, and we'd work in the garden and ride on the tractor and celebrate the gift of his own relationship with his dad. And certainly I remember watching lots of TV with my dad. Not that he watched a lot of TV, but it was just something that we kind of did together. And you know, my dad, when he was a kid, growing up in South Louisiana, grew up at South Down Plantation on the farm there. And my dad, born in the late 30s, grew up obviously in the era of the Second World War. And actually he has memories of Nazi German POWs living in South Louisiana as they were shipped over here to America. A lot of them arrived on the coast of Louisiana and worked in the sugarcane fields in Cajun country, and my dad grew up with some of them. And I think because of the era he grew up in, I think because of the memories of what he had on the farm, my dad lived and still does live with an interest in the Second World War. And I grew up with that in my own life, and certainly have lots of memories as a kid with my dad and I watching the black and white documentaries of the war and of Hitler and of the Holocaust. Now, as a kid, I really struggled with that. Just it never made sense to me. You know, on one hand, I was formed with a Catholic conscience by my mom and dad, and knew that God was a God who loved us and certainly created the world and had a lot of power. But at the same time, I could never wrap my mind around how God could allow that to happen. And even later on as a college student, the year before I graduated from Nichols, I spent a summer in Europe and kind of backpacked across Europe. And on that visit, spent some time at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany, and again, like it just didn't make sense. You know, if God exists, how can there be so much evil in the world? I remember walking through the concentration camp where, like, the silence almost pierces your heart as soon as you walk on. And it's almost like a blanket of sobriety and depth that just kind of pulls you in. I remember just thinking as I was walking around Dachau, like, all right, God knows all things, so God obviously knew about and knows about evil. And if God's pure love, then God has to hate evil. And if God can do anything, certainly God would stop evil, right? You know, even now, you know, when I think about abuse, or when I think about war, or when I think about the Holocaust, or when I see ISIS, I'm kind of back in those same questions about how can God allow the evil that exists in the world? Because I think that question, like, almost gives birth to another question, which is, can God be trusted? And I think a lot of times as a pastor, you know, I think I make a lot of mistakes as I invite you to trust God if we don't acknowledge that there is an air that we breathe, and there's almost a whisper in our hearts that asks, can God be trusted? And so I really feel compelled over the next few weeks for us to unpack a new series, a new theme, which is all about trusting God. And today I want to dive right in and ask the question, can God be trusted? Especially with all the evil that exists in the world. Because I bet you've asked that question. I bet you, when you watch the news and you see war and ISIS, when you consider the Holocaust, when you see abuse and violence happening in the world, I'm sure a lot of us ask that same question, which is why? Or look at your life. And I know some of the details of some of our lives, but I think all of us, I bet you bad things have happened to you in your life, because bad things happen to good people, and that touches our lives. And sometimes God doesn't answer your prayer, especially when you're begging God. And you might be asking for a good thing, and sometimes God doesn't give you the good thing that you really think would bless him and honor his presence in your life. And sometimes when we need God the most, our experience doesn't match our expectation. And, you know, it's like all of us are in Mark chapter 4. Last week I talked about Adam and Eve and how Adam was in Mark chapter 4, Jesus sleeping in the storm, and how ironic today that's the gospel today. And I think a lot of us perhaps have been in storms, and there's Jesus sleeping in the storm. And a good question for us today is, how can we trust a God who would sleep in storms? You ever feel like God's sleeping in your storm? Have you ever needed God and your experience doesn't match your expectation? Have you ever asked, how can you trust God? Or have you ever asked, how can you trust a God when there's so much evil in the world? And imagine if God spoke to that today. Like, what if we kind of dared God to speak to us? What if we actually believed that maybe he's spoken to that question in the past? Imagine if God actually wasn't afraid of the question, but had actually been inviting us to ask it. And I know that, like any answer that we kind of give to the question of evil or God is going to be inadequate, but I love what Father Robert Barron says. At least we can give it a gesture. So Like, let's right now together, let's ask the question. Let's see what God says. Can he be trusted? And why is it that he allows evil in the world? Let's put our hats on, okay? I want us to think a little bit today. I'm going to kind of walk you through some philosophy, but I want you to stay with me, okay? Evil in its strictest sense, it doesn't really exist. Philosophically, we would define evil as the deprivation of the good or the lack of good. So evil, you might say, is not something, but it's a lacking of something. It's a lacking of good. So God, who is pure love, who is all good, doesn't create evil. He can't create something that's lacking. In other words, the question really isn't, does God create evil? Philosophically, that can't happen, but we can ask, why does God allow evil? Why does God permit evil? If evil is the lacking of good, then good can be rejected. We have the capacity to reject God. We have the capacity to reject that as good. And so where evil is, there is the rejection of the good. So good can be rejected, God can be rejected, and where God is rejected, evil exists. And God has to allow the possibility for us to reject him, because that's the only way that in freedom we can choose him. Let me say that again. God has to allow the possibility of us rejecting him, because we have to have the freedom to choose him. And if there's the freedom to choose him, then there's, of course, the freedom to reject him. And there's consequences to us rejecting God. There are consequences to man's choices. And I think we live in a world where we don't want to accept the responsibility of choosing and of choices. I think we live in a world where we want what we want. And when we're faced with the consequences of our choices, I think it's an easy tendency for us to blame God. When in actuality, what we're reacting out against a lot of times is the sober reality that there are consequences to our choices, and we live in a world where people don't want to face the consequences of their choices. We live in a world where people just want to do what they want to do. And so when we're faced with the reality of evil, when we're faced with the reality, the consequences of not choosing God, we just want to blame God. Of course, the first reading today is from Job, and if you look at the story of Job, when you look at his misery, his questions, and God's response, I think it raises in us the fact that it only seems fair that if we're living for God, then he would be inclined to give us what we want. And that's what Job asks. Now, next week, we're going to specifically talk about why is it that God answers some prayers and sometimes God doesn't answer some prayers. But since Job is the first reading today, I just kind of want to acknowledge that exists, especially in a world where evil exists, and it can kind of complicate things and kind of challenge us in our trusting of God. I want to give us maybe a different question to ask, because I think at the heart of today's question about evil is also a question about God. Who is God? What is his nature? And is God a disengaged kind of doler out of gifts? Is he simply somebody who blesses us or gives us things and he's disengaged from the world? Or is God involved in our life? And is God essentially relationship? I love the image of an architect. Now, I just want to say that right now, that whenever we try to use images with God, we're already kind of dwindling down or losing in some depth the reality of that which we're talking about. But let's just stay with the image. And I love the image of an architect. I think God can be likened to an architect. In Genesis chapter 1, we see God as the great architect of creation. And I didn't say creator of creation, I said architect. Of course, we know that God's creating, but there's a very specific line in Genesis chapter 1 that I think kind of draws me into God as the image of an architect. And in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, we read, and I quote, "Then God said, 'Let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, of all the wild animals, and of all the creatures that crawl on the earth.' God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." So what we see kind of as the crown of creation is God creating us. He creates man. He creates the male and female. And we're not just created, we're given dominion. We're given authority to rule over the earth. And as we are given dominion to rule over the earth, you might say God's the architect and we're the contractors building the building. Stay with me here for a second. The architect is pure love. The architect is pure goodness. The architect has nothing but perfect designs for the building. The architect knows how the building's supposed to be built and gives the plans to the contractor, man, who has dominion over the earth, right? So man has the power, the capacity to build the building either according to the architect's plans or according to his own plans. Man has free will. The contractor has free will to either abide by the architect's plans or to stray from that. Now, what if the contractors stray from the blueprint? What if the contractors do what they want? What if the contractors don't listen to the architect? Is it the architect's fault that the contractors failed? No. But wouldn't we expect to see the building compromised? Aren't there consequences to the contractor's decisions? The building might fall down. The building might be compromised. The people who live in the building might actually have to live with the choices that the contractors made. You see, like God's an architect. And he allows the contractors to build the building even if the contractors choose not to abide by the architect's plans. But here's the cool thing about an architect. An architect can still enter the building that he designed. And God can still enter the world that he designed. And God actually entered into evil. In the incarnation, in his birth, in the person of Jesus Christ, the architect enters the building. He enters the world. And he enters into evil that exists in the world. God enters into evil in his betrayal at the cross. Death. None of that was part of the original architecture design in Genesis chapter 1. But because of the choices and the consequences of the contractors, i.e. Genesis chapter 3, when the architect enters into the world, when the architect enters into the building, he's entering into a fallen world, a world where evil exists. And death did not exist in the original design, but even God entered even into death. And he triumphs over evil as he descends into hell on Holy Saturday, as he rises from the dead on Easter Sunday, as he opens up heaven for us. God triumphs over evil. God should not be seen as a magician, as a toy master who's just doling out gifts. God should not be seen as a disengaged entity who simply watches humanity like a puppeteer. If we're going to understand God, we have to understand why we're created. That God is relationship. And he enters into the world. He even enters into a world that rejects him so that he can be with us in the evil and in the suffering. Let me give you an example of my own life. I think probably the most difficult thing that I've ever had to face in my life, probably the most difficult thing for me to trust with was the clergy sex scandal in the Catholic Church and in the Catholic priesthood. I was ordained a priest in 2001, and maybe 8 months after my ordination is when everything came to light with the Boston sex scandal, which was really, I think, indicative of what was happening in many closed, dark circles inside maybe other places. And it had been brewing for years, and it just kind of came to light. And as a priest, feeling people looking at me in a different way, and as a priest, just filled with a lot of anger, I asked, how? Why? God, it's your church. How in the world can you let this happen? I said, God, it's your priesthood. How in the world can you let this happen? You know, I thought about the victims. I thought about their families. I thought about the parishes. I thought about the people in the pew who were affected by this, people reading the newspapers. How can God allow this to happen? You know, I thought about the thousands of good priests out there who obviously aren't on the front page of the paper, but they just get lumped together with the guys who are. And I thought about how in the world could God let this happen? So it's filled with a lot of anger, and it's filled with just a lot of questions, and that kind of loomed for, I don't know, maybe a couple of years. And it's kind of ironic that I'm sharing my heart with you here today from the campus of Creighton University at the Institute for Priestly Formation, because that's where I made my 30-day retreat. And it was during my 30-day retreat that God really spoke to the anger in my heart around the clergy sex scandal. And I was praying with Jesus' passion, and had this powerful encounter with the Lord as I, in my prayer, watched Jesus wash Judas's feet. I remember praying and watching Jesus before Pilate. I was praying and watching the crowds say, "Crucify him." And I could see the remnants of the same palms from Palm Sunday on the ground behind them. I was praying, and I remember being with Mary at the cross. And my experience of Jesus as I was praying was just one of grief. His ache on the cross. His ache as he washed Judas's feet. The grief in his heart as he looked Pilate in the eyes. The pain in his heart as he heard, "Crucify him, crucify him." I remember coming to realize as I was praying, the part of my anger with the clergy sex scandal was not just obviously the righteous anger at the injustice. Of course, that was part of my anger. But underneath that, or at least with that, was I had to admit, and I say this with all humility here, that a lot of times I want ease in life more than I want God. I just want life to be fun. I just want life to be easy. I just want to be consoled. And sometimes I want that more than God. I had to come face to face with the fact that sometimes in my life I don't want a God who's messy. And I certainly don't want a God who's a part of mess. I just want God to take away mess. I just want life to be easy. And as I was praying and kind of tasting the grief in Jesus' heart, part of that grief in his heart was a grief for me and for what I want more than I want him. And it was right there in the midst of the clergy sex scandal that I felt most out of control. I couldn't stop it. It was just big, and I realized that I didn't want relationship with Jesus in the mess. I wanted to be in control. I wanted it to go away. And I had to admit that a lot of times in my life, what is at the heart of my disdain for a God who can be a part of evil is the fact that it's harder to be in relationship with God than it is to face everything that the world throws at you. Now that's my heart. What about yours? Like, what about you? I bet you there are things in your life where it's tough to be in relationship with God right there, isn't it? So I'm going to encourage you just to one thing this week, just one simple thing. I just want you to ask the question, do you trust God? Do you trust that God is with you? And do you have questions in your heart that prevent you from trusting God? Now, I want you to imagine if you and I ask those questions, what will happen in our life? And I want you to imagine the consequences in our spiritual life if we don't ask those questions. Because you see, if there is something in us that's preventing us from trusting God, then it is going to have an influence on the structure of the building that the architect has asked us to build. There's a lot at stake this week when it comes to our relationship with God. And if there are questions that are there in your heart, we need to ask those questions to God. So here's what I want you to do this week. I just want you to, one thing. I want you to write a letter to God. Now, you don't have to give that letter to anybody. Nobody ever has to see it. But here's the one thing I want you to do this week. I want you to write a letter to God, and I want you to tell him everything that's in your heart, especially if there are places in your heart that find it hard to trust him, or things that have happened to you that make it hard to trust him, or things that you see in the world that makes it hard to trust him. I want you to put all that in a letter. As silly as that might sound, or as elementary as that might sound, I want you to trust the process. As I'm talking to you about trust, I want you to just trust the exercise. Write a letter to God. Get it all out. Unfiltered. Use whatever kind of language you want to use. Get as graphic or as explicit or as specific as you can possibly get. Write a letter to God. And then here's my challenge, because we're all big boys and big girls here. I want you to listen to his response. Write the letter first. Get it all out. And then I'm going to ask that you give God 30 minutes this week in silence. And I want you to beg God like you're begging for breath. I want you to beg God to reply to your letter. Now look, maybe it's important for you to go to the cemetery and ask him to speak to you, because that's where, the hang-up is. Or maybe you need to go to your childhood home. Like, I'm serious, and actually pray there. Or maybe you go to the adoration chapel or the church or your bedroom or a place where you can just be quiet. But wherever you need to go, I'm going to challenge you to give God 30 minutes of silence. On the website, I've got 2 Bible passages that might help you, Psalm 22 or Psalm 7, but whatever it is that helps you pray. Can you do one thing for God this week? Can you do one thing for yourself this week? Now imagine if we all did that. Like imagine if some of the most influential questions in our life, imagine if every one of us did that. Imagine if you could watch the news about the latest story of ISIS and you didn't cringe anymore. Or imagine if in the deepest places of your heart where prayers were unanswered, if you now had peace. Imagine what your life would look like if you had a God washing your feet in every moment of your life, and if you could trust him. Imagine what your life would look like if the architect were building the building with you. And imagine what happens if we don't. Imagine the consequences in our spiritual life if we don't. And imagine if God's been waiting for years for you to write that letter. And imagine what would happen in your life if he actually responded. What's in your heart right now? What do you really want from God? Take a couple seconds. Let's let the Lord bless us. Be not afraid. For right now, God's knocking on your heart. The apostles turned in the storm and asked Jesus to rise, and he did. And in today's gospel, he calmed the storm, and he said to them, "Be not afraid." I want you to close your eyes with me for a second. Just close your eyes. And imagine that you're in that boat in today's gospel. Whatever that boat looks like in your imagination, just big boat or small boat, but just look at the boat. Imagine that you're in a storm. You can feel the wind against your skin. You can hear the howl in your ears. You can see those storm clouds brewing. And imagine Jesus in the corner of the boat, sleeping. Just pay attention to your heart right now. What's it like for you to face that storm, quote unquote, by yourself? And how do you feel that Jesus is asleep? Now, right now in your heart, imagine if you just screamed at him and said, "I need help." He gets up right now and he looks at you with great love. The boat's rocking and you can just look at his eyes. And he says to you, "Be not afraid." And bam, the storm stops. And it's just you and him. Stay right there. Let him look at you. And listen to his words now. Do not be afraid.